U.S. Treasury is sending $20 billion. Hi everyone, Matthew Kruse at Comstock Investments. We did have a quarterly stocks report that came out here this morning. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because Brian is covering it for our premium subscribers for the Comstock report in a separate video. But obviously it was bearish report that ending stocks did come in quite a bit higher. It looks like they cut demand. The acres and yield didn't seem to change too much. Overall production was unchanged for the most part. It just looked like they made some reductions in demand, which added to the ending stocks for the corn. And so that's why you're seeing that the corn complex trading down the way it is today. I'm going to focus a little bit more on China's consumption of Brazilian soybeans as well as Argentinian soybeans. And first, I'm going to start out with looking at new crop planting in Brazil that's going on now. This is the weather rainfall that's been accumulated in the last couple of weeks, the second half of September in Brazil. You can see the southern part of Brazil has been getting really good rainfall, which has benefited the first crop of corn that's being planted in the south in Rio Grande do Sul. There's also the state of Paraná, which is right here, is where they've made most of the progress with soybean planting right now. And so that's where most of that progress has been made. There's been a pocket here in the northwest part of the state of Mato Grosso and the center part of Mato Grosso. And so we've seen some planting advance there as well. But most of the state has really gone without much at all. And it's still overly dry. And so they have made some good progress starting out, but there's still a long ways to go. And so we're looking out here, this is through October 5th. We talked about here in the southern part of Brazil, continues to see a lot of rainfall in the forecast. And there's a little bit kind of on the outskirts of Mato Grosso, but really nothing much at all is happening here in this growing region. And this here represents about 70% of soybean production in Brazil. And so there's, not much. It's very dry basically in the first part of October. Now, there's been some planting taking place, quite a bit actually, in the second half of September. And we talked to actually a couple of producers that have already planted 40% of their soybean crop here in late September. And they're kind of located in the center part of Mato Grosso. But oddly, they've shut things down and they've stopped because they felt like they got enough rain to start in that second half of September, but now the forecast has shifted drier again in the first half of October, and they don't feel like there's enough rainfall in the forecast to keep going. And so you see that a lot of times where the monsoon or the rainy season kind of give a head fake. You'll get a good rain and people will start planting, but then they'll stop and kind of wait for the rains to solidify and come back again. And that seems to be happening again. So this a little bit longer into the first half of October, things are leaning dry for most of this production area that we talked about. Still some rainfall for parts of Paraná and kind of parts of that northwest region of Mato Grosso, but still predominantly dry in the first half of October. Now, this is the GFS model, which is actually much less generous. You can see here, and it's throughout the month of October. We've seen some forecasts that show the second half of October is going to get a little better, but the GFS, not so much. And so we kind of have to go back and forth. I tend to prefer the European model a little bit better. But you kind of see here a lot of red, so which just kind of shows that well below average if you want to go off this for the month of October. The month of October is the most important planting month in the center west region anyway. Depends which region, but in the center west of October, they need to make a lot of progress in their planting. And, and so if it's the 1st of October and things are dry, that's not a huge issue. But if we get to October 30th and things are dry, then things are going to change. And I think the market will take notice. And so time will tell. But looking at the planting progress, it's still early. There's about 5% overall of the crop in Brazil that's planted. And some people point out, well, we're out above average starting out anyway, that's fastest that we've ever planted. But again, a lot of that's just kind of limited to that state of Paraná and not so much in everywhere else in the center west region of Brazil. And it's still early, right? 70% of the crop usually goes in after October 6th, and here it's September 30th today. And so we got quite a ways to go. There's a lot planted in the first half of November yet, so it's still early. And yes, it's starting out ahead schedule, but it's starting to shift dry again. So I think we'll see things slow down here a little bit as the country kind of takes a pause. This kind of gives you a comparison of acreage between Brazil and the U.S. with soybean acres. You kind of see here that we've flatlined or even starting to go backwards in the United States, projecting 81 to 82 million acres last year. And whereas Brazil, on the other hand, it continues to grow up. Whereas Brazil, on the other hand, continues to increase year over year, projecting closer to 120 million acres. No, time will tell. I think obviously the expansion there is slowing down due to the loss in profitability, and we'll touch on that in a moment, but still continues to advance and as it continues to take market share away from the United States. Now, this is some numbers that I've pulled from IMEA, which is an ag institute in the state of Mato Grosso. And so it's basically taking average production costs for soybeans just in the state of Mato Grosso, and it can vary from region to region. I may not agree with everything in their methodology, but I wanted to respect their numbers, and so this is exactly where I'm pulling from. You can kind of see there just the increased cost in production from last year to this year is up quite a bit. Now, a lot of that is somewhat artificially inflated because the exchange rate has changed from a year ago, where almost 20% that their exchange rate, their Brazilian currency, the real, has actually strengthened, whereas it was closer to 5.8 to 6 reals per dollar last year. And right now it's about 5.3 reals to the dollar. And so what that does is it makes it look a lot more expensive in US dollars, even though in their own currency, it maybe hasn't changed all that much. And so that's, partly the reason for that. But, if you come with an average crop yield of 55 bushels per acre with an average price of $9.40, you're looking at gross revenue of $517 per acre. That's about an $84 loss. And so the metrics are actually as bad or worse than they were last year at this time. It takes something closer to 64 bushels per acre just to break even. Now, there are certainly producers that can do that, at least on fields, but some of these large producers that planting 20,000 acres, it can be hard to do that in such a large acres. And so what this tells me is that you would think that growth and expansion, would be limited. And I think the market is already calling for that. Historically, they've expanded 5% year over year, and now they're saying 1 to 2%. So I think it would be, 1% or even less. It gets to a point where it just doesn't justify it anymore. That the average producer is frustrated right now in Brazil because they know that they're going into this losing money. And so if misery loves company, I guess the moral of that story is the U.S. farmers should be interested in knowing that Brazilian farmers are kind of in a similar situation right now. This is really what I wanted to focus on, that Argentina last week had announced that they were cutting export taxes on a lot of their ag products, which then led to China coming in and making massive purchases in their country. Meanwhile, the United States announced that we were sending $20 billion to kind of help prop up the economy in Argentina, which has been struggling for quite some time. And so obviously that raised a lot of concerns among the ag industry and U.S. soybean growers, just because Argentina is a competitor of ours, and yet we're sending our tariff money there to kind of help finance their country and keep things afloat. Now, you kind of see here what their Argentinian soybean and soy meal export complex has done over the last couple decades. Now, we kind of get different numbers, but one of the numbers that I've seen that China came in and purchased about 7 million metric tons between soybean and soy meal just last week within like a 3-day period. So that 7 million metric tons represents about 25% of their soybean and soybean meal exports historically. Now, there might have been a little bit that kind of entered into that new crop a little bit, but you add those 36 million metric tons between the two. China bought 25% of that in just 3 days. And so it kind of shows you that the lengths that China is willing to go to kind of avoid purchasing U.S. soybeans or soybean meal or just American made products in general. And that it also shows that they're still interested in buying. They're just not buying from us. And we kind of knew that, but this was just another clear example that the lengths that they're willing to go, that as soon as those export taxes were cut or dropped temporarily, China came in, made massive purchases. And so China has historically imported about 109 million metric tons of soybeans. And that number can go up or down depending on the year and depending on how their economy is doing. But we're coming up here in the last quarter of the year where on average they need to be purchasing 27 million metric tons between now and January. And that period is important because this is when Brazil's in their growing season. And so they're not going to start harvesting soybeans until next January. And so if China can get to the end of the year where they can close that gap of 27 million metric tons, they'll basically show to us and the rest of the world that we were able to get by in this more critical period when there isn't a massive influx of soybeans on the market. And so, that 27 million metric tons, so they just bought 7 million metric tons of it from Argentina in 3 days is all. And so that's why I think that that was significant. We talked about how the U.S. Treasury is sending $20 billion to Argentina to kind of help and prop up their economy. I think that number is important because obviously I think there's a lot of farmers out here that are looking and expecting to get something of similar fashion from the U.S. Treasury for financial aid, because obviously the tariffs are having impact on what's going on here in the United States. And I think at a minimum, if it's less than $20 billion, or even if it is $20 billion, we should probably be a little bit disappointed from that, because that's how much they value Argentinian farmers right now. And so we should expect something quite a bit higher than that. Now, that being said, whatever that amounts to, if it's $100 an acre, something like that, it helps obviously, but whatever it ends up being, if it's $100 an acre, I guess I'm concerned or skeptical that it's going to cover kind of the long-term negative ramifications that these tariffs are having for the U.S. farmer. And I think we've seen this in the past, and I don't think you have to look any further than what's happened in the wheat and the cotton industry, that the wheat complex was used for geopolitical reasons 45 years ago, and it's never been the same since. And that's my concern, that that's what's happened in the U.S. soybean market, that we're seeing a major shift here. And so what really needs to happen, rather than just give farmers a short-term bailout, is to take that tariff money, let's reinvest it in U.S. infrastructure and domestic demand. Let's build up the renewable fuels industry. Let's build up SAF, because that's going to have much longer term impact and I think better return on investment. My other concern is, and we've seen this in the past, where when we get a short-term bailout, a lot of that just ends back up in the hands of the input companies. It doesn't make its way into to the farmer. And so the input companies see that, ag lenders see that, and so they're all going to want their piece in the form of higher costs that they pass on to the farmers. And so how much of it really ends up with the farmer, I think, is debatable. So that's what I have for you today. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.